and innovative leaders in their fields from all walks of life. We will be discussing everything from politics to theology to religion to philosophy to life. Every once in a while, I may just be on here talking about whatever's in the news and whatever I think will be of interest to you. This is your host, Patrick Connolly, and I hope that today will be more than a conversation for you. Welcome to More Than a Conversation. This is your host, Patrick Connolly, and I am so excited to be spending a little time with you today, wherever you are listening. Today, you are going to be hearing a voice that most of you are pretty familiar with. He was with us on episode 6, episode 39, episode 52. In fact, I believe he is our most frequent guest. It might be him or Hugh Ross are probably tied somewhere in there, or Faz Rana. He's on quite a bit
that's
as well.
good. That's good company to be in, Patrick. I'm glad to do that.
They absolutely great company. Today we are joined by J. Warner Wallace. He has come to talk to us about another book, and a great book indeed. I just got done reading my advanced copy, and I was so excited to see just your skills coming together. But before we get into that, it's good to see you. How are things on your side of the nation?
Doing well here. We're on the West Coast. It's been kind of a mild so far spring. Not it's supposed to be sunny every day, but it seems like it's only partly sunny. So we'll see what happens here as it starts to warm up. But right now it's been very nice in the 70s. Can't complain.
Only partly sunny in California, so I didn't know.
What's the deal with
especially
that? That's not what I paid for, okay? I want the full sun every day in the mid 70s. That's what I expect, but it might be asking too much. I don't know. We'll see.
So you are joining us at really a very interesting time. There's a lot happening in the nation. There's turmoil. There's unrest. In fact, last night in our Bible study, our midweek Bible study, we're working on teaching folks how to go through the Bible as a narrative. As we were talking about that, I asked the question, where'd you get your first Bible? And one of the men in the room said, Gideon handed me my first Bible.
Wow.
At school. They were distributing these Bibles. And he talked about how the nation was in turmoil. And this is when the Vietnam War was happening and riots were happening on campuses and all of those things. And he said, I said, well, why do you think they gave you the Bible? He said, well, I think they thought that there were answers there. There was truth there. There was something there. And, we're in a time right now that history is repeating itself in many ways, whether it is anti-Semitism and the 30s, whether it is unrest and the 60s, whatever it is, we're seeing this. And then you come along with this book, and the central theme seems to be just that there is a deeper truth. I think that a lot of the angst that we're dealing with now is a lack of truth. Would you attribute a lack of concrete truth to what's happening in the world around us?
Yeah, I think what's happening is we are moving away, especially in the West. We've moved away from the foundational beliefs we held as a community, which even if you weren't a Christian, you or at least were the Christian worldview was so prevalent in schools and in your family structures that were pretty much still, for the most part, still intact. And as we move away from that the teaching of Christianity, it's either a coincidence, an amazing coincidence, or there's an inverse relationship, right? We got division and polarity and violence on the rise. Depression and suicide are really strikingly on the rise, just as we happen to also have a decline in the Christian worldview and its influence on our culture. Well, there's a reason why those are inversely related, because as one declines, the influence of a Christian worldview, I think the other increases. Now, the reason why I say that is because it turns out that if you were to look at the teaching of Scripture, even if you were just to look at, okay, I'm just going to make a list of all the things that help humans to flourish. Forget about Bible for a second. I'm not a Christian. I'm just taking a look at, from a secular perspective, at all of the teaching that's out there that's been studied, researched by sociologists, psychologists, people who are in the industry. And I made a list of all the things that help humans flourish statistically. And if I was really honest with the statistics, don't try to twist them or bend them, just be honest about how people fare in different scenarios. Here's what you're going to find. You're going to find that we flourish under the attributes that are described traditionally on the pages of the New Testament: the structure of parents, the structure of the parents to their kids, the role of marriage, the role of humility, the role of balancing all of our inclinations, just the nature of who we are as humans. Are we innately fallen? Are we innately good? These are things that if you were simply to adopt a Christian worldview, and I say this in the book, if you were to throw that dart right at that bullseye you're trying to hit called human flourishing, well, if you hit it, you'll accidentally, or not accidentally, providentially, be right at the center of the teaching of the Christian worldview. And that's what I think we've moved away from. So this book really just tries to look at 15 crime stories. And I'm trying to provide 15 life lessons in those murder investigations, but also to show how those attributes of human flourishing, which have been studied now by atheists for about 4 decades, happen to be consistent with what is taught on the pages of Scripture. The Bible's not just true, it's good. And that's where I think we've kind of moved away. I think, look at it this way. If young people think that truth is determined by subjects, that everything is perspectival, it's a matter of your context, your lived reality. So if I said this is true, you're thinking as a young person, that's true for you. The idea of truth and how we use that word has changed. And so the question, I think, for most young people is not, is it true? Because truth has changed. It's really up to the holder of truth from their perspective. The question is Christianity good? And I think there's been a sense that these values, the Judeo-Christian values, are not good. And if they're not good, then I don't care whether you think they're true or not, old man. The issue is they're not good. I'm not going to adopt a worldview that's not good. So I think the last couple of books I've written have really been an effort to demonstrate that Christianity is more than true. It actually happens to be necessary and beautiful and good for human flourishing.
It's interesting that you're going with this perspective of human flourishing, and I don't know that that was intentional as you went into the book. Maybe it was, but one of the things that people like you and I have always asked when people ask about, well, can I be moral? Can I be good outside of Christianity? Well, by what objective standard are you measuring that? And
Sure.
that's still a valid question, but it's often what you'll hear back, and I'm sure you've heard this many times: the reduction of suffering, or human flourishing, like you're saying. And it's so beautiful that even by this standard that is in and of itself not objective, and you could look at that and say, well, that standard's flawed because what is flourishing? But even by that standard, Christianity is again being proven to answer the question. Christianity, if you, as you've pointed out, if you get to the center of human flourishing, you're going to look around and go, oh, wait, I'm at least living the principles of Christianity.
That's
And
right.
that's how I got here.
Yeah, there's a chapter in this book that talks about suffering, and really how do we overcome trauma, and the idea that Christianity as a worldview offers the absolute best resources to deal with suffering. Because let's face it, if Christianity, if atheism is true, who really cares? There's no meaning or purpose to life, and as a matter of fact, everything you think you're achieving doesn't really matter because the universe is heading toward a heat death, and whether you're forgotten in 3 generations, and by the way, do you know anything about your great, 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 great grandparents? No, it turns out it doesn't take very long for people to be completely forgotten, no matter what good they do. And so if that's the case, there's no point in really trying to achieve anything in this life because all of it is perishing. Just live the most robust, exciting life you can live because there's no overarching purpose for any of it. And if you think about that, that can be a pretty dismal way to live because as you reach the end of it and you're no longer able to do the things you could do when you were younger, you're going to feel like you're less human if atheism is true because your experience is less robust. It turns out that a view like ours that extends life beyond the grave does have the tools with which we can survive suffering. In other words, we have a tendency to think that suffering is evil. No, there's a difference between evil and suffering. It turns out God often uses suffering to achieve unbelievable goods. And that's the kind of thing that we would think as parents. There's times when we allow our kids to suffer in some small way because we know we're trying to achieve something greater in the long term. Well, if life is beyond the grave and you've got an existence that is everlasting, well, then the question becomes, what is God trying to achieve with this suffering? What story, what chapter in your overarching story? And so I've got one chapter in this book where I talk about the fact that secular researchers have come to discover that something called meaning making is what helps people overcome trauma and actually grow post-traumatic growth. after a trauma. And it turns out that meaning making means what I can just make up my own meaning for my own story. Well, you could, and people who do that do better. But if there is an objective, overarching story that you're just a chapter in, that you fall into that story, well, then you could read the overarching story and find your place in it and discover if this suffering you're experiencing right now is the climactic, is the final chapter in your story, or is it the climactic chapter that leads to something beautiful on the other side? Every story has that kind of chapter. And the question is that what's happening in your life now? So meaning finding your place in the overarching story is what I see when victims' families, for example, move beyond. You think you can get closure with a verdict? You're not going to get closure with a verdict. You're going to get a verdict with a verdict. That's about it. Justice, if you're lucky. But closure, really, I think what you're talking about is I want to thrive on the backside. I don't want my life to end or to feel as though I'm defeated. Is it possible to flourish after this thing occurs? Well, that's really what meaning finding is all about. And that's why people who do that, and that's a very Christian notion, right? Because our worldview does not. It's Keller used to say it this way: if you're an atheist, you really can be happier if you think less about your worldview, which tells us that the universe is coming to a heat death and nothing really matters in this life or 10 lives or any of it because it's all going to expire. But if you're a Christian, you'll be happier if you think more deeply about your worldview, because if you put your mind on eternity, you set your mind on things above, as Paul says in Colossians, then you can actually thrive on the backside of trauma. So it turns out that a lot of the mechanisms that atheists use with their counseling sessions are actually kind of inherent to the Christian worldview. And that's what this book is really all about, is if Christianity is true, Patrick, then it ought to describe the world the way it really is, including humans, the way we really are. And if we have been designed by a creator, it seems to me that the best instructions for a life would come from that creator. And that's what I think this is a line of evidence in these 15 chapters, 15 pieces of evidence that Christianity is true. And it kind of goes in that big cumulative set, right? I've written books on the reliability of Scripture, the evidence for God's existence, the impact of Jesus on culture, and here, how human flourishing attributes that are described in the New Testament actually provide evidence for the Christian worldview.
I think the way you access that through these stories is a beautiful thing as well. And people from different backgrounds, people with radically different, I mean, at the end of the day, you're interacting with them because there's a crime, a terrible crime typically that's happened in their life or somewhere near them. And I'm just grateful I met you after you were, retired from that life, because that means I didn't meet you through such circumstances. But that being said, all of these folks have dealt with some tragedy, something happening. Yet these profound truths are there. Just like you just mentioned that counseling, if you get to the highest level, okay, what's the most effective thing? I would almost submit that if you go into any field of study and you say, what is the most effective manner? Well, ultimately you're getting to an objective truth. And that objective truth can only exist because there is an objective truth maker. There is whether, we're talking about obviously things like mental health and human flourishing and things that are a bit less tangible. But ultimately, trigonometry was discovered because someone said, I believe there's a truth maker and I'm going to follow after that understanding. And they came to truth because of that. And I believe now we're in a world that has denied God. But if you seek truth, you're going to find God. You're going to find Christian principles at the end. I think, for example, someone obviously big even in the world of podcasting, but like a Jordan Peterson, I don't know where he is on his journey. I can certainly see faith showing up. And he honestly talks about things like the cross sometimes with a level of reverence that some Christians don't. But as I see him taking this journey, I feel like he's doing the opposite of, the discovery of calculus, in that he didn't start with the truth maker, but I believe I can see him coming closer. Another example, I don't know, have you heard about Richard Dawkins and his declaration?
Yeah, I did hear that he loves at least that the culture that's created by Christianity in Europe, and he hates to see that that go. But something you said was very, very important. This idea that the objective source of moral truth is important to us, and here's why I say that. There's a couple of chapters in this book. One on the first one on wisdom. It turns out that secular research on the nature of wisdom, and I cite this in the book, includes what they call a moral pillar. In other words, and here's how I usually put it. Could I say, for example, that there's a wise way to do a kidnapping? Well, I guess if you maybe if you mean that there's a way I could succeed, but if you mean, is it ever really the wise to do a kidnapping? In other words, there's an incumbent moral truth. So we would say that nothing is wise if it violates a moral standard. But the question, of course, then becomes, well, how do I ground the moral standard? Where do I get that from? I'll give you an example of this. I've worked gangsters who have a completely different set of moral laws. And they would say, yeah, there's a wise way to commit a kidnapping or a drive-by shooting. Okay, well, that's because their standard is not an objective standard of good and bad. It's a relative standard relative to their gang life. Okay, so that's why we would say that it turns out that if you want better wisdom, if you want wisdom that's grounded objectively in a moral standard, you have to then at least embrace the idea that there's an objective moral standard giver. This is also true, for example, when you look at quality relation. I have another chapter in the book on quality relationships. Unfortunately, a lot of murders occur because you're hanging out with the wrong people. And what qualifies? Well, they've done a lot of studies on this. It turns out that it's not just any set of friends. It is the deepest relationships you have with just a small, select group of friends. So if you don't have a small, select group of deep relationships, you won't get the benefits of quality friendships. And it turns out there's another element to this, which is virtue. So you could have a small set of friends who are deeply connected to you, but they are criminal, and you're not going to lead to flourishing. It turns out virtue is, again, another important impact maker. Well, then the question becomes, well, who decides what's virtuous? Because almost every group I've ever worked that was nefarious thought they were relatively virtuous. So the question becomes, who gets to decide that? So once again, we have this idea that we need an objective standard, both for the value of wisdom and both for the quality of friendships. There's lots of ways in which that objective standard, and let me just give you one more that I thought was important. Like we talk about this, especially in the culture we're dealing with right now. As we're recording this, there's all kinds of demonstrations all over the country about all kinds of principles. And the question becomes, well, how do we embrace people who have a different worldview? How do we love people who seem to, and some on their face at least, to be unlovable, right? Or they just differ from us, and so you might consider them unlovable, but they just differ from you on a certain issue. Okay, well, if we want to love like God loves, I've got a chapter in this book that talks about this. It turns out that if you look at Scripture, Scripture says God is love. So you can do an equation. God equals love. It doesn't say that God can love. Of course he can. Or that he creates. It says that God is love. So there's an equation there. You could write out God equals love. Okay, great. It turns out also that if you read through your Old Testament and New Testament, you'll find that God is continually described as the fullness of grace and truth. The fullness of grace and truth. You see it in the Old Testament. I've cited all those passages. And even John, in writing his gospel and describing the appearance of Jesus, in the very first chapter says that Jesus comes in the fullness of grace and truth. He's not saying Jesus is a really cool guy. No, he's actually making a claim to deity, because only one being in all beings holds grace and truth in fullness. We don't. As a matter of fact, every page of the New Testament letters is a letter writer who's basically saying, guys, you're not being gracious enough, or guys, you're accepting everything and you're not being just enough. Like you're not being discerning. Why? Because we don't hold those two things, truth and grace, love and justice, or mercy and justice, love and law. We don't hold those two things in perfect fullness. We're always out of balance, always out of balance. Now, here's what's interesting. If the equation is God equals love, but God also equals the fullness of truth and grace, you can now take God out of the equation. Love equals the fullness of truth and grace. And most of us don't get that. We think to love like God loves means we just have the grace side. There's no truth or justice. That's something different than love. No, it turns out that is love. Love is the fullness of truth and grace. You cannot love someone like God loves them if you're just about the grace side. but never
Right.
calling out sin. God judges sin. This is why the cross is the fullest representation of this, because God both satisfies the penalty for sin and offers us a way to not have to pay the penalty. Jesus pays that for us. So there you have the fullness of the justice of God on the cross, but the grace of God as he applies that act to us. So if we just wanted to look at the world around us and wonder, well, look, I've got friends who are doing things that my Christian worldview says I wish they wouldn't do that because I know that's sin in the eyes of God. Well, we could just invite them over for dinner and never say a word. Then we'd be exercising the grace side, the mercy side, but we would not be exercising the truth and justice side. So it turns out if we want to love like God loves, just make a list of every act of mercy you've shown somebody who differs from you and ask yourself, have I also shown an act of truth and justice? Or flip it, for every act of justice and truth you've shown somebody, are you just harping at them, or are you also
Mm.
showing them the other side, which is the grace and mercy? It's holding those two things in balance. And I've got a chapter which shows how this is our nature, and this is something we have to do. We call this parenting, we call it tough love. Tough is the truth and justice. Love is the mercy and grace. So tough love is this effort to hold these in balance. And most of us who are parenting and trying to do it well, we get this. And we may think, oh, maybe this term has kind of fallen out of favor. But when we actually parent, we typically balance those, or try to balance those two things. Well, that's what we have to do with our friends who hold a different view than us in the world around us. And we're going to see a lot more of that. And you're seeing it right now. So the question is, it's easy to get on social media and just bang out the truth and justice part. I don't think social media is a great place to exercise the love and mercy part. So that's why I limit my interactions on those issues to personal face-to-face issues. I don't, every time you move away from three-dimensionality, every time you move away from a face-to-face, if it's just a video like we're doing right now, or it's just audio like we're also recording right now, or it's just a text message, the further away you get from three-dimensional face-to-face, the more difficult it is to hold those two things in balance. So I just don't do important conversations as I move away from three-dimensionality. If you don't know that person personally and you aren't able to live in their life, shut up. Just move forward. And I think there's a place for us, of course, to say things, but it's holding those two things in balance is got to be the rule that dictates everything else. And so if you think you've got a way to do that on social media, have at it. If you don't, pull back to those relationships you can do both at an equal level.
And as we deal with that grace and truth balance, in interacting with others, you point out something. And I believe, in fact, for those that get the book, that would be the chapter "A Tale of Two Brothers" that lays that story out very well. Just the danger a mother raises two sons. I won't do a spoiler alert. I won't go deep, but one son is raised by one set of ideals. She thinks I went too far. She goes the other way with the other son, with a very costly result in their
Right.
lives because of that. And so we deal with that though. But you actually, and it's always interesting when I talk to you because I think by nature of where you live, I think you're a few years ahead of a lot of the apologetics community. I think by nature of, I'm in the Bible Belt. We're definitely cultural Christian in a lot of ways. But we're not quite post-Christian. It's not differing ideas still have a cultural pushback, but you're in an area where you're interacting with a lot more diversity, at least ideologically. Like we have racial diversity, economic diversity, but we don't have a lot of ideological diversity. And
Interesting.
so I think it's interesting, and that's again something I think you're kind of on a cutting edge, and there's other regions in the country where someone could be and have that diversity, but as we begin to interact, it's going to be so important because we're trying to win people from an absolutely different worldview. We don't even share common narrative. My children attend a classical education school, so they are heavy Western civilization. They're learning from the Greek myths. They're doing the things that have been archetypal for things you and I take for granted. Things, just phrases, but a lot of our society does not have that. And I think you're really touching on something And I think that's one thing that the book does is help us understand that no matter what worldview people come from, no matter what their perspective is, somewhere beyond that, there's a truth. And that truth is God. And love, for example, and I love that you did a little theological algebra there with balancing the equation. But if we're dealing with folks in grace and in truth, ultimately that's how we know, am I having godly love? But we're showing them God. They're getting that actual glimpse of God. And you mentioned parenting, and that's something that has, I'm in the throes of parenting right now. I've got a 9, a 7, and a 2-year old. Conversations are getting deeper. Just we even had a conversation the other day. Our girls came home. They're talking. One of our friends said such and such about someone's relationship, and we're just trying to have this conversation
Right.
and just things you don't really realize that you're going to be talking about, or something happens on TV or whatever. And we try to be extremely careful with what we show them, but we also
Mm.
try to always have conversations.
Yeah.
But when you talked about that balance, that's immediately where my mind went, was parenting. And I want to segue into something else from that. You wrote a chapter on an issue that is incredibly important: fatherhood.
Yeah. Get ready for the controversy. I can tell you already, as I have kind of, pushed this out. And we have to. Writing a book is easy. I always say that anyone can write a book. The question is getting someone to read it. And so a lot of the time we spend is with people in the marketing industry who are talking about where would this book go and what might be tricky. And I can see right away that there's 2 chapters in this book which will be controversial, just in terms of how the culture perceives these 2 topics, fatherhood and marriage. Those is a chapter on marriage, is a chapter in fatherhood. These are issues, though, that it turns out the data has been clear. And I cite one source in here because when the data came out originally about the benefits of marriage, of raising children with their 2 biological parents in a low conflict setting, that's the secret sauce. All the data shows that if you will raise kids with their 2 biological parents in a low conflict setting, you'll get the best results. Now listen, are there outliers? Of course. Any data survey is just taking generalities. You'll always find somebody who breaks the norm. But generally speaking, that's what data does. And by the way, both sides use data like this, so it's not like we're the only ones. Generally speaking, now what happened after all that data came out years ago, you saw a heavy push of researchers trying to refute it. Oh, any family structure will work. And so I finally cited somebody who said, really, the only way you could make that case is if you twist and you have a bias going into the data. The data is pretty clear. And we see that we have a fatherless issue right now. Now, look, I was not raised this way. I was raised by a single mom. My parents divorced when I was 3. My mom never remarried. So there was no man in my life growing up. And was it, I came out okay. Was it ideal? No. No, of course not. And I wanted to right that ship from the moment I met my wife. And I also didn't raise my own family that way because I have 2 adopted kids. So I have 2 that are biological and 2 that are adopted. I think we're doing better for those adopted kids than they would have been if they'd have been in an orphanage or even in the situation they were in. But is it ideal? Of course not. We're not their biological parents. So I'm not against the options. We're going to live those options. Those are real. But the data does consistently show that people who raise their 2 biological parents who raise their kids in a low conflict setting have great outcomes in every level of human flourishing, whether it's mental health, whether it's physical health, whether it's your educational grades, whether it's rate of income, whatever you just, and I made a list of all of these in the book. I think we have twice the number of pages in the PDF file for the footnotes than there are pages in the book because there's so much data on these 2 topics. And so you could run from that if you want, but if you work in law enforcement, you kind of know this is true because a lot of our calls are domestic violence calls. A lot of our calls are dealing with people who grew up without the benefit of that kind of family structure. And the fatherlessness issue, if you're working in gangs in Los Angeles County, that's where I first encountered it. And I was much younger than I am now. My kids were very young. My 35 and 33-year-old were probably 5 and 3 or 6 and 4, something like that. And I remember thinking at the time, what is the common denominator in all these different cliques of gangs that were very different racially? They were very different socioeconomic status. They were all in different parts of the city: Hispanic, Black, white, Korean, you name it. We had it all. And if you looked at the commonality, here's what you discovered: lack of dad. And lack of dad looks different depending on the group. Sometimes lack of dad is a guy who's been locked up his entire life as the son is being raised, and his dad's been locked up his whole life. Or maybe they never knew who dad was. Or dad's a deadbeat who's not involved. Or dad's a workaholic who's never home. Yet they
I
have a
was glad
great,
you pointed that out. I
yeah,
was
a great
very glad you pointed
standard
that
of
out.
living. They're driving, these gangsters were driving Acuras, but they didn't have a dad who was at home. They were just, so I realized that lack of dad doesn't really matter what version of lack of dad, but when dads are not interactive with their kids, you see consequences of that lack of interaction. You just do. This is not just true for boys. This is true for girls as well. So I cite in the book all the studies that show that, yes, incarceration rates, risky behavior rates, all of the things that we don't want to see our kids do are far more likely to happen if you've got an uninvolved father. Now, look, I'm not trying to negate the importance of moms. Don't get me wrong at all. I'm just saying this is because this is the truth in true crime. This is what I'm encountering as I'm working these cases, and you will see it over and over again. As a matter of fact, when someone tells you they came from a family where dad was really engaged and they're now committing crimes, it's shocking. You're like, going, what went wrong? Well, why are you doing that? Because it's so rare. And right now, we have the largest percentage of kids being raised in fatherless homes, and we have to kind of deal with this issue. It's not, and by the way, it crosses over all kinds of ethnic boundaries and racial boundaries. So this is not just a problem for only one group in our community. It's a problem for all of us. And what we've done is we've just said that marriage is not that important. And your commitment. I was just at a wedding, and it was a secular wedding. And as I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, wow, what is it that they can hold up? Like, what keeps us? And listen, I was married before I was a believer. My wife and I didn't become believers until 18 years after we met. So when we got married, we did not marry under a covenant with God. But I did know this: my parents' broken marriage was a mess for me growing up, and I was not going to do that to any kids I would have. And I was committed to marriage. I love marriage actually more than I love my spouse. That's the commitment. If there's an idol in my life, it's marriage, because before I ever knew God, the thing that I centered my existence on was that I wasn't going to let that happen again. And then when I got into law enforcement, I just saw the consequences of that. So we have to make a decision. Is this worth talking about? Of all the chapters I've written, the chapters that get the most knee-jerk reaction from fellow Christians are these two chapters.
Hey, More Than a Conversation listeners, I hope that you are enjoying this conversation as much as I am, and I hope that you're getting something great out of it today. I'm just wanting to jump in here in the middle to take a moment and let you know a few ways that you can help out More Than a Conversation. First, wherever you're listening, please go ahead and click that subscribe button. That will definitely help, and that'll make sure that you get all the content. Also, if you have a way to rate, if your app allows you to give a 4-star, 5-star, whatever the rating is that's the top rating, I would so appreciate if you would go ahead and drop a rating there. That's how the aggregators and the distributors rank podcasts, and the higher the ranking you give, the more ears will be able to hear these great conversations. Thanks again, and I'm hoping that today has been more than a conversation for you. Now let's get back to it.
That's
Wow.
why this is impacting the church. We have to, as a group, say, no. Listen, and Paul says this in his letters. He says, you're going to be married to something. You're either going to be married to your commitment to God in ministry, or you're going to be married to a spouse. He would far rather, it sounds like, have you married to your commitment to God. But for those of us who take a spouse, well, that becomes that's the picture of Christ in the church. And that commitment, we're not to love our ministries, our pastorate, our podcast, our books the way that Christ loves the church. We're to love our spouses. That means that's a higher priority. And typically, if you're a guy like me, or just a guy in general, your identity is probably in your work and how much you can achieve. This is another chapter in the book on identity. It's so important for us to center this, because most of us will put our time and effort into whatever it is we think we are getting our identity from. Our purpose and value are directly connected to our identity. So how we see ourselves, you know, it's so important to kind of figure out. As guys, we always enter the room, right? And right away we meet a stranger, and what do we say? We say, "What do you do?" And we don't really care what you do. What we're asking is, who are you? Because for guys, what you do is who you are. So we have to kind of address those issues also. I have some of that in the book as well.
An incredible thing for us to realize is that this truth, whether it's controversial to Christians or not, these are biblical principles. And as you talk about fatherhood, we talk about the life changing things that happen. I'm sure you saw the research, but for the sake of the listeners, there's things, we talk about sons and dads, well, daughters and fathers. A girl is much more likely to be promiscuous, to have a child before she's married. She's much more likely to be in poverty. She's much more likely to be in abusive relationships. She's, in fact, I don't know if you saw these studies or not, but literally not having a father in the home, we talk about promiscuity, literally changes the age at which girls move into sexual maturity. And in boys, it changes their telomeres. If you saw any of this? The telomeres, I'm not a geneticist. We should call Fuzz and he could help us out with that.
Yeah,
but,
right.
This is what determines length of life. And the telomeres are drastically shorter in young men who are raised without a father. So
and if you look at it just from a practical perspective, I know growing up without a dad, this feeling of being unprotected is raised my anxiety level. And I still, as an old guy, have that shadow. I'm much more likely to over-prepare, to be overly anxious about protection issues as an adult, because that was my fear growing up. I had no one to protect us. And as a kid, I knew I couldn't protect my single mom in the 60s and 70s. I just wasn't going to be able to do that. So I never felt safe. And so I think a lot of that is, if you didn't know anything about the biochemistry, you just know that when you carry anxiety into adulthood, that it all comes from how we were raised. And then the question becomes, well, is that going to be positive for you or negative for you? Look, it turns out that what gets me and what has been shocking for me, Patrick, is just that that the response would be that the chapters that would have the most kind of concern, like, can we say this out loud? Nothing in that. Well, let's see. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. What I've also noticed, for example, is when people read this, especially younger people, there's a sense in which to offer advice in some ways is saying that you don't like the way that I'm doing it. And since we're now in a world where we all hold our own set of values, to say, and I often say this in criminal trials, hey, if she hadn't opened that door, she would be alive today. That does not mean it's her fault that she got murdered. But I do get to trace the series of dominoes that had to fall before. That's how I explain the trial, or explain the case to a jury. But we're getting to a point now where I wonder if I say, hey, don't do this, because if you do this, there's a negative consequence. Are you shaming me? Because I do that. So there's a point at which, if I say, well, marriage has huge benefits, and early marriage, as I make a case for in the book, has huge benefits. Are you shaming singles? No, I'm not shaming singles. I'm simply reflecting the data. Are you shaming single parents when you're saying that fathers should be more involved with their? No. Are you shaming single moms? No. Are you blaming victims when you say that this victim No. But we're at a point now where even offering look, what is Proverbs? Proverbs is simply a series of, hey, don't hang out with fools. Don't do that. It's saying basically what you're doing now is contributing to stupid. So stop doing that. That's what Proverbs is, okay? But are we at a point right now where we can't even tell a generation of Christians that they ought not do something? Because to say that means we're either shaming them for how they're living today or blaming them if something goes wrong. And I'm not trying to do either of those. But it seems like we were raised by parents, at least who said, hey, don't do that. By the way, have you ever told your kids, don't walk alone in the dark alley? Stay with your friends on the lit side of the street. Well, if something happens in the dark alley, can I say that then? Could you say afterwards, well, you shouldn't have walked. I told you not to walk in the dark alley. Well, no, because now you're blaming the victim. Well, no, actually what you're trying to do is to prevent future things that will harm your kids. And that's where a book like this, any wisdom book, is an effort to say, hey, there might be a better way. But I wonder if we're in a place where the word that's under contention is better. So if there is no objective sense of better, if everything is subjective, personal, or collective, well, then we're not going to even be in a place where we can write books that would offer a better way. Because, and by the way, that's probably 70% of books. So we
Yeah.
have to kind of get real with whether we can even say, hey, there's a better way. Before we even address the issue of fatherlessness or the role of marriage, can we make these statements in general? And that's why I wonder, maybe I'm just getting too old to bridge that gap. But I think that there is still some wisdom. By the way, this is when wisdom is developed. Half the stuff that I'm talking about in this book, I had no idea about in my 20s. I hadn't started working as a detective. I learned this stuff by watching people struggle, which, by the way, is one of the ways you gain wisdom, through watching the failures of others. You fail. Failure is really a key component to wisdom, but it doesn't have to be your failure. It can be the failure of somebody you're watching. Well, that's what I hope a book like this does, is it helps you to see, hey, here's some cautionary tales so you can live a better life and make a case for Christianity.
Absolutely. And you asked what Proverbs is. Proverbs, Jim, it's mansplaining. That's what Proverbs is.
Yeah, see, there you go. So yeah, forget about it. And listen, that is something. Don't what you just said is so powerful, because I think we are in a generation that says, okay, look, this is the source. Your ancient, tribal, misogynistic text is the source of all things ailing us. And all racism, misogyny, homophobia, transgender, whatever it may be. This is the source of all bad. And that's where I think we have to start to write books. That's why I wrote Person of Interest, Why Jesus Matters, what is so beautiful about his impact on culture. And this is a book that tries to do the same thing. It's not just that it's true, because I would have argued as an old guy, well, can anything be good if it's not true? Well, my dad would have said yes. And my dad's still somebody who thinks you should go to church, but he doesn't think it's true. He just thinks it's useful. Okay. Well, that might be one way in for a lot of people. It might just be, if you've ever listened to Tim Keller's work up in New York when he was alive, he had a very secular audience. And sometimes he would be kind of accused of holding secular views on certain topics. But if you really listen closely, you'll see that no, he's just pitching it in a way his audience can catch it. And he wants to pull you from that view toward a Christian view. And he may start off with simply, does that view you hold work? Because this one does. And you'll flourish under this view. And that doesn't mean this is why you should adopt it. But it turns out, if it is true, it should help you to flourish, right? If it's the words of your creator, it should have some impact on how the creation lives. So I think there's a way into Christianity, which is kind of backwards. It's not through the gospel first. It's through conditioning people to see that this might have some benefit to you. We are so selfish and self-centered. Wish I had my Bible here last night. We were doing a study, and what Luther said about our self-centeredness is so true, that we really don't do anything, even good, without having an eye on how it'll benefit us.
Right. No true altruism, they would say.
That's right. And so that's another chapter in the book, by the way. Can humans be altruistic? So I think, for us, what we have to do with this generation is to help them to see that this not only is true, factually true, and evidentially true, but it is beautiful because it comes from the mind of the Creator.
Absolutely. And I do think you're definitely onto something with that human flourishing angle, if we want to call it that, because it's been said before, if you lay a map of the Reformation over a map of the world, and look, how Christianity has affected the world. One minister friend of mine likes to use the phrase redemptive lift whenever the gospel comes into a family, comes into a neighborhood, comes a city, a nation, whatever. People are lifted, even non-believers, just by these principles becoming part of their life. I will say you have got quite a collection here in the book, some great stories. Those of you that are looking for a great book, obviously true crime has been something. It's something it's they don't call you the evidence whisperer for nothing. And I think, do you still hold the record for most Dateline appearances? Didn't you have that record at one point?
I think I do, and that's not because we did anything spectacular. I think it's just because we had Keith Morrison and a producer in Dateline who became friends, and we came back to the same well a number of times. But yeah, I think so. I think we still hold that record. Mm-hmm.
We know that is something that you're familiar with, and you've done a great job in all your books of laying out the concepts of being a detective, taking people on that journey in a way that is entertaining. Now, I told you that I thought Person of Interest was your best work, and Person of Interest is an incredible book. This book, breaking it down, these almost separate short story styles. It's incredible. You've done more great work. I'm going to put this one right up there alongside Person of Interest. I think all of your books are incredible. And for those of you that are listening, I know, I mean, those Netflix specials don't keep getting made for no reason. So there's a genre of true crime, but don't just read the crime for the macabre details. This is an opportunity for you to find out timeless truths through real stories of things that actually happened, incidents that were investigated, crimes that were solved or unsolved, and people that suffered, and some that found truth and justice. But in the end, we discover that God's truth is there. Now, I don't know, again, you covered a lot of topics. I think this is one, and I'm sure you've got more stories. There may be a truth in true crime too. I don't know. That's I could definitely see that. But Jim, for those that want to follow you or find the book, what is the best way for them to do that?
Well, look, we always say that you always want to exhaust what's offered for free before you buy someone's book. That's how I feel about it. So we spent years creating free resources, and they're out on our website. But for this book, it's just go to thetruthandtruecrime.com, thetruthandtruecrime.com. And if you go there, you'll see there's a bunch of videos. There's a 30-session case makers course we're offering with the book. There is a bunch of PowerPoint and Bible inserts and just ways that you can take the content of this book and either teach it to others or train yourself at a higher level. And we'll put everything out there. You'll see how to get all that for free if you buy the book. And that is at thetruthandtruecrime.com. Again, we always feel like it's awkward as a guy who is a retired detective living on a pension. Okay, so what am I doing in this side of life? Like, what's the ministry life we're going to have as now that we're able to do this financially? Well, I don't want to be a bookseller. I don't write books to sell them. I write books because I feel like these ideas need to be on the table. And so then the question becomes, well, then how do I level this so I don't feel like I'm just selling you a book? I want to open a door to resources, and that's what I hope this book does at thetruthandtruecrime.com.
Absolutely. And again, let me encourage everyone to get over there. In reading the book, one of the things that is so important, it's especially as we enter this world that you've heard us talk about today, is being able to understand these truths. And most people who are listening, you're not going to go to seminary, you're not going to take those courses, you're not reading deep academic things because you don't have the time. And often those things are not palatable in the way that they're written. You are going to find deep, real truth, and it's going to be explained to you in a way that will allow you to internalize it and then present it in conversation to your family, to your friends. So I cannot recommend enough that you go over to thetruthandtruecrime.com and grab a copy of this book and use it. I've used it. I've read every one of these books. My kids have autographed copies of your kids' book that you did. We've used the other resources. I cannot recommend it enough. Jim, thank you so much for joining me today. As always, it's great to talk with you, and I'm excited to see this book getting into as many hands as possible.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Patrick. I always appreciate it. You're one of my first interviews on this book, so I'm glad to admit it was you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. And for everyone else, I hope that today was more than a conversation for you.
Thanks again for being part of More Than a Conversation today. If you'd like more content like this, check out my blog at www.pastorconley.com. That's PastorConley.com. Again, that's PastorConley.com. I'd also love to see you join us in worship at Garden Sanctuary. If you're ever in Rock Hill, South Carolina, or the greater Charlotte area, we'd love to have you stop by and worship with us. Check us out at www.gardensanctuary.org. That's gardensanctuary.org. Until next time, I hope this has been more than a conversation.